One of the main motivators for starting the Unbiased podcast was the polarization of nearly everything in American society, from the coffee we drink when we get up in the morning to the pillow we sleep on when we go to bed at night. And our guest for this episode literally wrote the book on the subject, technically 2 books. Bob Talisse, chair of the philosophy department at Vanderbilt University, joins us to discuss his 2 most recent books, Overdoing Democracy, Why We Must Put Politics in Its Place, which discusses how politics have invaded nearly every aspect of American life, and Sustaining Democracy, What We Owe to the Other Side, a follow-up to the first that explores why political conflict is not just necessary, but good for democracy. Welcome, Bob.
Good to be here.
Yeah, and I left this out of the intro so Arjun could cut it out, but one of your credits also includes trick-or-treating at Glenn Danzig's house, I learned yesterday. So for those of you not familiar with 80s era punk rock, go ahead and Google it. It's pretty cool. Quick question, since this might be edited out. Glenn Danzig's house, was that the big candy bar house, or no? Or did they just give the standard like fun size stuff?
It wasn't. No, it was just. It wasn't anything special.
All right.
His mom was very, very nice, though.
Yeah, it figures. Well, don't believe the hype, everybody. So I think a good place to start out is the beginning of Overdoing Democracy, because I think it really tees up a lot of what we're going to talk about today. You start off the book with a story about your dad and his neighbor. And can you talk a little bit about that and maybe why you chose to begin your book with that story?
Sure. So the story is that, my father was, for as long as I knew him, was a Republican. He didn't only vote Republican, but he had pretty conservative political views. Also had very negative views about the Democratic Party. And so, he had pretty clear political views. The guy who lived across the street from us when I was growing up was a union guy, and he was very clearly a Democrat. He had some very liberal views. He grew up in the 60s. It struck me as I started working on the Overdoing Democracy book that these guys weren't only neighbors, they were friends. And not only friends who, shared the end of a dead-end street together and, lived in houses across the way, but, they were real friends. They would hang out together and, do stuff together and help each other, fix one another's car and things. And I thought, well, that was peculiar. These are 2 guys who didn't let their political differences get in the way of a pretty deep friendship. And I started looking into some of the sociological and other kinds of data that we've got now about the United States electorate and the citizenry more broadly. And those kinds of friendships have become, in the past 30 years, strikingly rare. That is, the idea or the frequency with which people from not only different but opposed political viewpoints would nonetheless have a healthy, supportive, cooperative friendship is really uncommon in the country today. And that is in line with broader trends of the political, as you said, Dan, invasion or saturation of our social lives in general. And so once I started seeing those trends from the data that liberals and conservatives in the country systematically shop at different grocery stores, enjoy different kinds of television programs, listen to different kinds of music, wear different kinds of clothes, even decorate the interior of their houses in systematically different ways. Once I started seeing that, I started thinking, wow, politics, or more precisely, partisan affiliation has sort of colonized our social spaces in ways that have permitted it to organize and shape our relations, even our relations that arguably don't have much to do with politics.
Why
How's
do you
that?
think that is? Bob. That's so fascinating. Why is this
Well,
change?
it would be surprising to me, Arjun, if it had a single explanation. So I'm sure that there are lots of factors that go into explaining how this has escalated, since the 80s. And no doubt, technology has played its role. I'm not one of the people who thinks that social media is the root of all of our political dysfunctions. It might be a part of most of our political dysfunctions. But I will say this, one possibility that strikes me as plausible. Since the 80s, American citizens on the whole, generally, I don't mean I'm not talking about particular people and their circumstances, but the trend has been that since the 80s, more and more of our lives are the products of our own choices, right? I'll just give one very quick example. When I first moved to Nashville from New Jersey, there wasn't an Ethiopian restaurant in Nashville. Now there are 3, for example. And so when I first moved to Nashville, if I wanted, good Greek food or good Mediterranean food in general, or maybe particularly good Ethiopian food, I was kind of out of luck. Or maybe there was some way to, order ingredients online or something. And so now, more and more of the conditions under which one lives in one's day-to-day life are selected, right? We have more options available to us. Maybe because of the internet, the books that I can buy are not limited to the books that happen to fit on the shelves of my local bookstore, right? I can go buy any book that's in print, practically. And I don't have to rely on a bookseller to choose that. And similarly, I just learned today, I can get Indian ice cream across the street from my office here on campus. Again, amazing, right? This is all very, very good. But it also means that more and more of my life is the product of my choices rather than just the result of some constraint, right, on that my environment has imposed on me. And so what I think that means is that we have more and more leverage over how our lives are organized and who we interact with and what kinds of messages we hear. And unsurprisingly, I'm not saying this is dysfunctional, I'm just saying unsurprisingly, we tend to make our little slice of the world in our own image. We like to hear the things that sound to us, sound good to us. We like to eat the food that tastes good to us. So we like to interact with people who we think are simpatico with our values. And so that's a quite natural thing. I think that the overall effects, though, of that ability to choose, which is also the ability to filter out and exclude, I think that when it comes to large-scale effects, they can be very bad for democracy. And I suspect that that's part of the story of the ways in which partisan identity has come to colonize our social lives, is that more and more is up to us.
Yeah,
Fascinating. I like it a lot. Sorry, go ahead, Dan.
No, I was gonna ask. One of the things you bring up here is the fact that we really have the ability to self-select our environment in a way, and so where we all watch the same newscast and maybe read the same newspapers if we lived in the same city, now we have our choices and we can kind of go down our own preferential habit trails, so to speak. One of the concepts you talk about in your work is the whole idea of group polarization. The idea that when we continually surround ourselves with people who are more alike, we become more extreme in a way. Can you explain how that works and maybe give a couple of examples as to that process in action? Sure.
So good. What's called group polarization, or sometimes I call it belief polarization, because there are lots of different ways to talk about polarization. All of them are about groups. And so I'm just going to say belief polarization because it is a cognitive phenomenon, right? We tend to think of polarization in the Joe Biden sense, or at least the sense that Joe Biden highlighted in his inaugural address, which is the rancor, the division, the seeing the other side as the enemy rather than as somebody who needs to, be convinced. The cure for polarization in that Joe Biden sense is what he said it was. Unity. Unify. Stop seeing hear each other again. Listen to one another. And that is one sense of polarization. It's the pulling apart of partisan opponents to the point that the common ground that they might occupy on the basis of which they might cooperate falls away. And so all you have is intransigence and animosity and log jams and paralysis. That might be bad. That is bad and for democracy. Belief polarization is a cognitive phenomenon, though. It's something different. Belief polarization is not a measure of the divide between two opposed groups. Belief polarization is a dynamic that occurs within the minds of members of like-minded groups. So we're only talking about one group now, right? The Republicans, the environmentalists, the skateboarders, whoever it may be, right? It doesn't matter much what the basis of the like-mindedness is even. But it is a formal version of what we sometimes think of more colloquially as the yes man phenomenon. The more you surround yourself with people who just tell you how smart you are and how great you are and how everything that you think is right, how everything that you believe is true, the more confident you get in your own judgments of things, the more disposed you become to dismiss counter evidence and critics. But also, here's the kicker, the more you surround yourself with people who confirm your views, you also become more extreme in your thinking. That is, you become a more radical proponent of the view that you hold. So in some experiments, and I'll just use one intuitive example, I think, with juries. You get a bunch of jurors in a jury room together. If they are like-minded about the guilt of the defendant, and if they are like-minded that the infraction is serious, the longer they talk about what the right punishment should be, the more severe the punishment is. So the more they interact as a like-minded group, each member of the jury starts recommending a higher punitive damages award, for example, or a longer sentence, for example. And in experiments where they actually have done these sort of mock jury kinds of things, these sort of simulated jury contexts, they ask the jurors before jury deliberations about punishment. The guy's guilty, yes. Is the infraction serious? Yes. What do you think the punishment should be? And jurors give various answers. Oh, he should be forced to pay, $10,000 in damages. And then the experimenter says, well, would you support a punitive damage award of $20,000? And the subject sometimes says, oh no, that's too severe. And then you put that subject in a jury deliberation. And if there are other members of the deliberating body that want the more severe $20,000 punishment, they quickly escalate beyond $20,000, even though none of the facts have changed, even though it's often not a matter of hearing new reasons or right all the thinking about the severity of the infraction has been done already. They're already all convinced it was severe and that the guy's guilty. It's just a matter of group dynamics that the individuals start endorsing much more severe punishments than the one, even more severe than what they said antecedently or before they started talking was the cap. So that's just one kind of example. Let me give another one because it's funny. You get a bunch of people together who all agree that the city of Denver, Colorado is notable for being high above sea level. Get them talking. The longer they talk, the higher above sea level they think Denver is. It's remarkable. So you might think that the jury case is about a normative judgment. Yeah. It's about what somebody deserves. This is just a banal matter of fact. How high above sea level is Denver? and you ask somebody, how high do you think it is? And they say, oh, it's, 2,000. I guess it's close to 5,000 feet, but 2,000 feet. Oh, do you think it's 10,000 feet? Oh, no. It can't be that high, right? And then the longer they talk, the more they go, towards the thing and sometimes they'll even exceed what they said was their upper limit. It's a widely documented cognitive phenomenon. It doesn't vary significantly with any of the demographic features of people that you might think it would vary. It doesn't vary with level of education. It doesn't vary between political affiliation, ethnicity, economic status, religious conviction, and it's been found to be pretty stable. It's been found all over the world and studied all over the world.
I wonder, Bob, people have a pretty good bullshit meter. It seems like, it's one of the reasons why we have low trust in the news and low trust in government is when people feel like they're being sold something or being pushed towards a conclusion, they have a natural reaction to be like, yeah, I don't know, this guy's blowing smoke. But if that's true, does that make us eventually fall out with groups that are so like-minded? Do we all walk away after a while going, this was kind of fun for a while, but I'm beginning to get the sense that this is a little obsequious, it's stifling, it's actually monotonous, and I don't know if this is really a good thing for me. Like, do humans eventually get around to saying enough is enough?
My hope is yes, but here's the one feature that is less frequently modeled in the belief polarization experiments, but is more prominent in real life applications of like-minded groups, particularly politically like-minded groups, are more extreme selves, right? As we shift to these more confident and extreme views, we also become more distrustful of anybody who's perceived to be outside the group. We become more likely to interrupt them when they're speaking. We become less likely to hear what they say as criticism of our view rather than just whining and complaining. We become less good at factually reporting what they say. So I say, well, that guy is not part of the group, and what did he just say to you? We become less accurate reporters of what they say. And so part of the phenomenon clearly has got to be, the escalating distrust and animosity, and in extreme cases, disgust with the outgroup, whoever they may be, and the tendency to perceive anyone who's not obviously a member of the in-group as the most extreme, radical opponent out of a member of the outgroup that we can conjure. You see this, by the way, in real time, it seems to me. I just think not too long ago, although it's not as present now as it once was in political discourse. Think about disagreements over immigration policy in the United States when Trump was president. It was very easy to find, even, political commentators who otherwise you think might be more nuanced than this. It was easy to find people saying, if you don't think there should be a border wall, you're for open borders. You think anybody should come in. Or on the other side, if you think that there should be immigration reform, you must hate foreigners. Which again is attributing to all critics only the most extreme, usually the least plausible version of the opposing view. That's part of the phenomenon as well. And so because it seems that, especially in high-stakes political matters, maybe the stuff about Denver is a different story, but in high-stakes political matters, unfortunately, it seems to me, we really like disliking other people. It's fun to hate people politically. It's fun to, own the libs or dunk on Ted Cruz. By the way, undoubtedly it is fun. But that's that affective, it's not only we become more extreme, we become more hostile towards the other side, we get more entertainment out of seeing the other side put in its place. Leads me to think that if there are limits to this, the phenomenon has a pretty broad breadth.
Yeah, we're not there yet.
I don't know that we're going to exhaust it anytime soon.
Yeah, I think some circles would blame Donald Trump for the tone of politics. I mean, I'll ask for your confirmation on this. It doesn't seem like Donald Trump really introduced anything new. He just did it at the presidential level where most presidents were sort of above it. Is that a fair observation?
Yeah, I would say that that's probably right. I think that he captured and articulated a common view about American government. Well, a common view among a certain part of the electorate about American government, that they're all crooks and everyone's corrupt and it's always everyone's lying. And what Trump did, at least as I see it, we're still not far enough away from that period in our history, I think, to have really detailed, settled views about what we all just underwent. But the way I see it, or the way I think about it now, is that what Trump did is Trump was the first to articulate the following kind of thought at the presidential level. Since American government is all bullshit anyway, I'm going to be overt about the bullshit. I'm not going to hide it. I'm not going to hide it. I'm not going to try to dress it up. I'm not going to disguise it. The other people who talk about, shattering democratic norms and civility, that's all just, that's all just a con. And I think that part of the appeal of Trump to the people to whom he is appealing is that persona of the guy who's, sort of tearing away the smiley face that's been plastered over the harsh reality of American government, and not pointing to it and saying, look, we got to fix this, but saying, this is the kind of mess American government's always been. I'm just not pretending otherwise. I think that was the appeal.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Obviously that's a whole tangent on Donald Trump. I think, at least from talking to readers of the Factual, which is a fairly good cross-section of the United States, our readers and listeners are all across the U.S. and pretty politically balanced. One of the things that I've noticed is that there's often a failure to separate President Trump's personality and demeanor and composure from policies and ideas that he had. And so, at least in our readership, we often hear from people who agreed with his ideas, but not necessarily his manner of execution.
Yeah.
But the two get conflated, and so it seems like people are supportive of his style, when sometimes they're not necessarily that. It's just that they're supportive of his ideas or his policy direction, which may be in stark contrast to what the Democrats were doing.
No, I agree with that. And sometimes I think it worked, that very dynamic worked against him. That because the instinct or the strategy maybe was always to lead with the manner, right, with the style. Yeah. Sometimes the policy messaging got lost. That seems clear to me. But I think also a lot of the policy thinking got muddled.
Dan has a lot more information on this as well, but in speaking with our past guest Diane Hessen, who interviewed 500 voters across 5 years, roughly half Republican, half Democrat, what she found is a lot of times people are voting against something rather than for something.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't necessarily that they had even thought the proposal through or were necessarily like, wait, is this going to expand government? Right? It's a lot better than what so and so said. So I think there's a whole bunch of that going on.
Yeah, no, Arjun, you both bring up a really good point here, which is when it comes to the coalition you need to assemble in order to win office, you need two groups of people. You need the people who really like your candidate and the people who really hate the other candidate. And your ability to mobilize both is critical to getting in office. And even if we look at the 2020 election, the enthusiasm surrounded Trump entirely. People either really enthusiastically like Trump or really enthusiastically didn't like Trump. And in a lot of ways, Trump really dictated the election. What I'm interested in, Bob, is getting back to this idea of great group polarization, or belief polarization, getting back to this idea that the in-group becomes more and more extreme over time. What I'm curious about is, how does that anti and pro coalition, how do they stay together? I think with Biden, you have a scenario where there's a group of people within the Democratic Party who think Biden won, we have a mandate, let's go after things that we love, like, universal pre-K, universal health care. And then there's another group of people who are like, whoa, I just voted because I really didn't want the other person. How do those dynamics play out?
It's a really good question, and there are all kinds of different ways in which they do play out. Political coalitions, especially, successful ones. The Democrats have the problems that they have because they won. So political coalitions, have often have this problem where a lot of voting behavior, as Arjun was saying before, is driven by, negative partisanship. It's I'm against the other side more than I care about what my side's for. I don't want to see the other person get elected. But, once it comes to the actual task of governing, of choosing policies, of drawing up priorities, a lot of the details and a lot of the policy specifics that were papered over or glossed over when you were building the coalition have to now come to the fore. Here's an example. If you want to see how belief polarization works on the left, go look at your social media feed on the night of the Met Gala, where we all got a photo of AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, wearing a dress with a message on the back that said, "Tax the rich." Go back and look at the social media feed of people who vote Democrat, vote for the Democratic Party, consider themselves liberals or progressives, somewhere on that spectrum. See how the threads about that dress, see how quickly they devolve into fights over who's truly progressive. So note what's happened. We've got a occasion among people who, on some metric, are like-minded. They exhibit similar voting behaviors, support, maybe Biden wasn't their first choice for the candidate, but they supported him in the end. We get a slogan, tax the rich. We're no longer worried about, defeating the MAGA people, or, we're no longer complaining about Donald Trump's most recent outrageous thing. Now the question is, what does tax the rich mean? In real terms, what's the policy that's being gestured towards or referenced by the slogan, tax the rich? And what you see develop on social media that night is a bunch of people saying, oh, billionaires should pay their fair share. There shouldn't be loopholes. And then you get others who are also consider themselves progressive saying, no. Tax the rich means there shouldn't be billionaires. And then other permutations come out where, no, tax the rich means, right? Now, again, I'm not laying these out because I want us to talk about who's got the right interpretation of the slogan. What I'm pointing to is the fact that like-minded groups do really well when they are fixated on their own commitments understood mainly as slogans and their animosity towards the other side. When you remove the other side from the conversation, when the group turns away from its cross-partisan animus and towards the task of figuring out where they as a group stand with respect to positive commitments, you discover that there's lots of disagreement. This is not a surprise. There's lots of disagreement among liberal progressive coalitions about tax policy, about criminal justice reform, about environmental reform, about the whole host of issues, as there should be. Here's the thing that's distinctive about group polarized groups. They become less able to navigate disagreements among allies. And in the face of disagreement over the tax the rich message, what you find on the social media feeds is they very quickly stop talking about what the right interpretation of the slogan is. They very quickly drop the topic, what should our tax stance be, and start fighting about who's an authentic member of the coalition and who's merely a poser.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's such good guidance for what's sort of exacerbating polarization. So I guess my question to you is, what do we do about this? How do we get off this train?
You know, it's a really good question. There are a couple of things that I think are really important to mention. One is that the data, the evidence about belief polarization is so robust. It's just naive of any of us to think that our political judgment is not vulnerable to it. By the way, when I give talks about this and talk about belief polarization, people very quickly see it in all of their political enemies. They're like, oh yeah, those people, they're just like carried like they're on a boat and it's high tide. They just get carried along, with whoever the most radical among them is. Like, okay, you get the phenomenon, but just, be a little bit humble about this. Like, what makes you so special that, this isn't, maybe it's not impacting you to the exact same degree or whatever, but you're vulnerable too. So that's one thing. Second thing is that, because when we hear the word polarization, we're so tempted to think about the distance between liberals and conservatives or Republicans and Democrats, that we overlook what we've just been talking about, this internal cognitive phenomenon that drives us to shift to more extreme and insular positions. I said, well, once we think that polarization is in part the problem of that phenomenon, because notice, more extreme coalitions that are more insular and more saturated with politics, this makes the job of, political campaigning really easy, right? If the candidate can say, well, if you're going to vote for me, chances are you also like this kind of music, drive this kind of car, live in this kind of home, then, the actual rhetorical project of campaigning becomes very easy when you can count on, your likely voter having a pretty specific profile in their general lifestyle. It's very easy, which is why polarization isn't going to be fixed by politicians. They like it, no matter what they say. They benefit from it. But once we see polarization as this internal cognitive dynamic that we are vulnerable to, you say, well, you have to recognize that it's not just about the way that you dislike and are disgusted by the other side. Polarization is about you and your allies. The thing that has to happen, I think, if we're going to get a fix, if we're going to be better able to manage polarization, so we have to take steps to diversify, ideologically diversify, our conception of who can be our ally politically.
I think that's right. I think the challenge, as you've clearly said, is we don't have the constraints we used to back in the days of your dad. And we can now pick and choose everything from our friends to the places we eat, etc., all to align with our. So it sounds like your solution is that we have to consciously combat the easy decision. It'd be so easy to just go to this club because I know everyone there thinks like me, and rather consciously say, I kind of want some variety. I want a little bit of tension or differences. Is that too idealistic, Bob? Like, are people really going to do that, or are most people going to be like, those academics, Bob and company, forget it, I'm taking the easy route?
No, I think you're right that there is a real worry about, how, I'm tempted to say there is a point in the severity of polarization where we will have tipped over to a degree of this that is not really manageable anymore. So I'm worried about that. Let me suggest one other thought, because clearly one way to diversify your conception of who can be your ally, maybe one way of doing that is to, find people who disagree with you, but not too much. Maybe people who disagree with you, but you suspect that they, didn't vote for the person you really hate, that they vote in ways that are similar to you. Maybe there's ways to build coalitions with people who are unlike you in lots of respects, but very much like you in some particular. So maybe that is part of the story. And I think that you're right to where, are people going to do that? It sounds like a drag. Here's the other thought, which might make things sound even more academic and pie in the sky and, what a surprise. He's a philosopher who's about to say, I think that what we need is more occasion for solitary political reflection. I think that part of what's happened to us as a citizenry is we've ceded, we've given over to media, social media platforms, podcasts, how ironic, time and space and energy that we otherwise might have spent reading a newspaper by ourselves. And I worry that we have this conception of democratic citizenship that says, what does democracy look like? It's people in the streets holding government accountable, blockading bridges, getting out there and acting in concert in a way to, call attention to, injustice and all the rest. And that is what democracy looks like. I'm not denying that. But democracy needs citizens not only to be active, but to be reflective. And a lot of the modes of political activity that we associate with the core of democratic citizenship are now engaged under technological conditions that dismantle our reflective capacities. And so part of the solution, I think, and this might be even further pie in the sky stuff, is we need to reclaim moments of our lives for political thinking, for civic activity of a reflective kind that occurs outside of the gaze of allies and enemies alike, outside of the conformity pressure that comes when we're engaged with people who are just like us, and outside of the triggers for animosity that occur when we're in the presence of somebody who we suspect voted for the wrong guy in the last election. So, sometimes, democracy looks like guys in the people in the street carrying signs. Maybe it also looks like a guy sitting in the chair behind me reading, Aristotle's Politics and thinking about big, obscure, abstract political ideas that aren't about us.
I don't know if this is coincidence, maybe a happy coincidence, Bob, but it turns out that some of the things that we're doing at the Factual may create the environment that you're talking about for some of these things. So, for example, it's a place where people read and discuss the news on a daily basis. And first of all, it's, like I said, relatively it's nonpartisan and has a very diverse population of readers, roughly equal Democrat, Republican, or conservative, liberal, whatever you want, independents. And so in the daily discussion, you see a lot of different viewpoints. And then secondly, we remove many of the performative aspects of technology and social media. You can't see number of upvotes on a comment. You can't see, there's no followers and likes and hearts. There is, we have a like button, it's called the respect button, sort of indicating you can respect something you disagree with even, but there's no counts on it. And so it allows you to express admiration with something, but not say things because you're going to get a lot of likes or votes. No one's ever going to know it. You would, but no one else will. And so what we've always said internally in the team is, if you go through the comments of people in the votes, in the polls, and Dan and I do this regularly on You Don't Have to Yell, what we often see is that people who vote yes or no on an issue, a lot of times in the comments have very similar comments. It's almost the same thing. They just sort of land slightly differently on either side. And so what we're trying to show is that, hey, a lot of us actually have very similar policy ideas, maybe slight shades one way or the other. But in a non-performative environment like the Factual, you can express it and not feel like you have to say something that gets the lion's share of attention. You just say this. So maybe, happily, we are doing a small bit of what you're saying, Bob, and bringing together people that are of different ideas, helping them to express themselves in a frank, honest way, but not in a way that's attention grabbing and headline grabbing, and helping people see that actually we're not that different, actually.
Well, that sounds right. And, I tell people, audiences, this all the time, and they're astounded, despite the fact that partisan animosity, dislike for the other side has escalated significantly over the past 30 years in the country. Actual policy differences among citizens have remained steady. They haven't escalated. In fact, in lots of cases, they've eased. So we're less divided over the rubber hits the road. What should government be doing? Right? We're either no more divided or in some cases less divided than we were in the 80s. We just think that the other side holds the diametrically opposed views from the ones that we hold, and we dislike them for it. But it's all a kind of misperception. So anything that would help dispel that illusion, like the format that you're just describing, seems to me to be a step in the right direction and a step towards depolarization.
The only way this us versus them narrative works is if there's one us and one them. There's a bill on the floor of the House right now that's actually designed to really introduce the possibility not only that more moderate voters will have an advantage, but also potentially more minor parties will have an advantage. So you could see 3-4 parties. I think at that point, it's very difficult to play the us versus them game when there's 3 thems or 4 thems as opposed to just one.
Right. I think that's right. So I hope you're right, because part of me, just to go back to an earlier comment in response to one of I think the first question that Arjun raised, surely animosity and resentment and indignation are finite emotional resources for American citizens. Surely there has to be a part where we run out and where we get sick of it and where we don't want to deal with it anymore. And when that happens, if it does happen, some political agents, a party, a candidate, clearly will be ready to capitalize. I don't mean capitalize that in a problematic way. I mean, surely we'll fix on that and use it to marshal positive political forces rather than let those people divest from the process. So there's some hope in that, at some point we just get tired of hating each other. I hope that's right. Yeah. I hope that's right.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe I'm an optimist to a fault, but it feels like the people that I meet day to day, whether it's in my neighborhood, on travels, or in the Factual, first of all, it actually relates back to your book, Bob. It's when you talk about things other than politics, you realize there's so much more in common, and people are actually quite nice and cordial and thoughtful. They may hold different political viewpoints, but who cares? Like, that's not always the most important thing. And then even when we do get into the politics side of it, it's not a combative discussion to start out with. Like, we're not there to pick a fight. You can, you sort of hear different points of view and you're like, oh yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily agree entirely, but I can understand why you might hold that point of view, which is good. And it makes me understand you better. It doesn't make me hate you. It just makes you understand you better. So I don't think humans are wired to hate. It's too exhausting. I just find it, I think we're wired to actually maybe not necessarily trust by default, but certainly be friendly by default. How about that? And
that sounds good.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that, go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, I just want to tell a story that is the story that closes the Sustaining Democracy book. So the story came by way of somebody who is a philosopher who I'd never met, still to this day haven't met in person, who got interested in my work and just sent me a note saying, I wanted to tell you about this thing that happened. She's a pretty left-leaning, progressive philosophy professor who found herself, after getting her PhD in Chicago, I believe, in a rural part of Pennsylvania, a pretty conservative part of Pennsylvania. And she said, I live next door to this older couple. It's clear that they're conservative. it's clear to them that I'm not conservative. And so, we both realize that we're politically on opposite sides of things. And she says, but we walk our dogs together. And I talk a lot, with my neighbors about dog breeds and dog training. And we take care of each other's dogs when I go out of town, I leave my dog with them. And then there was part where there was, they were sharing, vegetables that they grew in their backyards and things, which is the kind of thing that that you're describing, right? That, there's this other thing, this other mode of engagement that enables each party to the activity to see the other person's virtues in ways that are not tied to attributing a partisan identity to them, right? And that's what I think is really important about non-political engagement, is we need occasions so that we can demonstrate our virtues to one another in ways that doesn't make it so easy to say, oh, he's a fellow Democrat, right? Now, here's the kicker in the story. This person writes, after a long time of getting along with dogs and gardens and everything, the male of the neighbor, the couple that's the neighbor, on a dog walk asks the philosopher, very solemnly says, "Can I ask you a serious question?" And the philosopher says, "Sure." And the older man says, "Does the Q in LGBTQ stand for queer?" And she said, "Yes." And he says, that's part of my problem. I was raised to think that that was an insult and a slur. And that's why I'm so uncomfortable," he goes on to explain, "about some of what's going on in the country. I can't hear that word without thinking that it's being insulting, that it's meant to insult somebody or demean them. And I don't want to do that." And the philosopher writes to me and she says, all of a sudden, right, I saw a kind of consideration about resistance to pronouns and other kinds of, sort of more gender inclusive linguistic interventions. So all of a sudden I saw a different kind of reason that someone might be resistant to that I still don't, she says, I still don't think that that's a good reason to, insist on, gendered pronouns. But it did strike me as it wasn't just blatant, bald, discriminatory tendencies, right? It was just a slightly more nuanced, moral kind of motivation that, might still be objectionable or criticizable, but not what I was inclined to think it was.
Yeah. What is
And
that,
the Sustaining Democracy book ends on that. I said, that's the kind of thing
I like that
we
a
need
lot.
more of.
I just saw this quote today. Someone, it was on Twitter. It said, "Don't attribute to malice what could be sufficiently explained by stupidity." And a lot of times people just make mistakes or misunderstand things, or you haven't heard them, but it's very seldom malicious when something rubs us the wrong way. Very few people go out there going, "I want to hurt you. I want to insult you and harm you." It's more, "I didn't get it," or "you didn't get me," and that's most of the time, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah. I think we tend to assume that the people who don't think like us have either not thought it through or are dealing with some faulty reasoning, and that they haven't really weighed all this out. And the reality is when you talk to folks, they're like, no, generally everybody puts the same amount of thought into things, more or less, on average, and they've just reached a different conclusion. The more you can dig into the why of why somebody thinks that way, at the very least, you may not agree, but at least you'll understand how they got there.